Okay, here we go. Hello and welcome to our final session of our three-part series, Accelerating Student Learning, Navigating Toward True Co-Teaching Practices. I'm Janelle Mercado, the SIP project coordinator from El Dorado County Office of Education. And on behalf of our team, we'd like to thank you all for being here today. The Supporting Inclusive Practice Project is funded by the California Department of Education out of Riverside and El Dorado County Offices of Education. So we'd like to thank our respective county offices and the Department of Education for supporting this professional learning series. Just a friendly reminder that you can access all of our no-cost resources on our website at sipinclusion.org or follow us on social media through Instagram, Facebook, or X at SIP Inclusion. So if you missed the previous two sessions, you can access the recorded webinars on our resource Padlet or on our website. Session 1 was dedicated to a system design of co-teaching, and session 2 was centered around classroom practices specifically. Both sessions were presented by Dr. Marilyn Friend. And today we have the distinct honor of learning from Dr. Paula Kluth, who will provide us with her expertise in supporting students with extensive support needs through co-teaching. Dr. Kluth is an author, educator, and overall inclusion ally, and I'll just also add a very good time. Today's presentation will also be recorded and posted to our resource Padlet. So feel free to share that with your colleagues who maybe can't be here today. Our team is also on board in the chat to support you throughout today's session. We're going to do some moments where we stop and ask you to share your questions. Feel free to drop any questions that surface for you throughout the session as they come up. We also have enabled closed captioning, so please access that as needed. And with that, I want to hand it over to Dr. Paula Kluth to lead us through our final session.
Thank you, Janelle, and welcome to all of you. Welcome from, not from California, but I'm in the middle of the country here. I feel like I'm nice and close to you, though, through the magic of technology. So I'm actually absolutely delighted. As Janelle said, we are going to be wanting to dialogue with you in our time together. So I'll ask you at different intervals to throw something in the chat. And I know some of you may be, you may be multitasking, or you actually may be home already and dealing with children or with dinner. So I'll just say, if you have a free hand and you can throw something in the chat, that'll be helpful, not just as a way to communicate with us, but I always feel like other folks may get some ideas or inspiration from you when you share some of your thoughts. So love to hear from you in those moments if possible. And then of course, we'll also have some time for questions. All right, let me start by giving you a little bit of information about myself. As you can see here from the title, this particular session. I feel like a lot of these ideas, of course, are relevant, if not all of them, are relevant no matter what your co-teaching context. So if you're teaching kids, who do not have this label of extensive support needs, I think the recommendations that I have for you are still going to be potentially useful. And I think in general, they are helpful, just collaborative thoughts. So look for that. And if you are somebody who maybe is not yet seeing some of these learners, you might still be able to have some takeaways even for, for tomorrow, for next Monday, what have you. So be thinking about the practicality of that. I want to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about myself and where you can get some resources and some information after our time together. So this is me. My background is as a teacher, I think like many and most of you here. I am a special education teacher by education, and very specifically, my certification would be in what we would call complex support needs, extensive support needs today, but what would have been called severe and profound way back in the day. I started my career thinking about and planning around kids with some of these really unique learning profiles, but I immediately worked in inclusive schools. So I have worked with in high school and middle school, elementary school. I've worked with kids with and without disabilities. I've always worked in inclusive classrooms. So even though I have that lens, what I bring here today, I hope, is some practical ways of thinking about keeping the needs of those learners in mind, and then at the same time, creating as robust and interesting and appropriately challenging lessons for all kids as possible. So I've done a lot of writing on these topics. My most recent, after being a school teacher, I was a university professor, most recently at Syracuse University. And I wrote the book that this is based on with, I have to give a shout out to Dr. Julie Costin, as some of these ideas are also, from that resource and from her. So we'll also see some resources from Universal Design Daily, a book I did on UDL, and we've given you some pages from those books. So I'll call those out. You don't have to go and get any of these resources. We've given you the relevant pages that match up with the recommendations here. I am someone who's like really passionate about, well, of course, inclusion, but you're going to hear themes around working with kids on the autism spectrum. So I've worked a lot in that, with that, sort of done some research in that area. I'm really interested, as you can see here, with topics like universal design and differentiation. And so hopefully that will come out in some of the ways that we're, that I'm presenting, and thinking not only about how we think about our collaborations, but even how we approach our lessons. So we'll see that, some of that, at the very end of the presentation. Let me ask you, as my first sort of way into this conversation with all of you, if you have a free hand, could you just throw into the chat, what is your role? I'm interested. I know that, maybe we have a more of a skew of special ed teachers maybe here, or co-teachers primarily, that are looking at this population of learners. But I'd be interested in knowing if we have speech therapists, or if we have any social workers here, or general ed teachers, or we administrators. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. It looks already like a mix. School psychologists, general ed, excellent. So we've got science, we have math already. I feel like we've got a whole school filled with what we need. Program specialists, please keep those coming in, because I do like to kind of check in with the chat and kind of make some of those connections as I'm giving examples. So yeah, if you have a free hand, go ahead and share what is your role.
Paula, we have the Inclusion Dream Team on here.
I'm sorry?
We have the Inclusion Dream Team on here.
We do have the Inclusion Dream Team, indeed.
With all the different disciplines. It's amazing.
We do. We're primed. We're ready for, there's like, they can throw anything at us. We've got somebody to answer that question for sure.
That's right.
I love it. So thank you for sharing that. That's actually really helpful to all of us here on our end. All right, two more things logistically. One is, this is sort of the one-stop shop for me. So as you can see on this slide, that is sort of the place to find me. So if you want to send me a message, you can find me on my website, which is Inclusion Rules. I'm on social media, but really this is the most direct way to find me. You can contact me if there's something I say and you miss it, or you can't find a resource I reference. Go ahead and find me here, and I would love to, hopefully clear up for you those kinds of questions. There's also a lot of resources here so that you don't have to go and purchase something, right? There's blog posts, there's free video. I'm going to show you some of that video. There's a lot of short articles. You don't have to ask to use it. If you are doing your own internal PD and you find a video helpful, you can go ahead and pop that right in, and that's exactly what it's there for. So it's not only a place to find me, but it's a place to learn more about inclusion, get resources. Finally, I want you to be ready to go. So in the name of UDL, I want you to be hydrated. So make sure, I know in the day, it's hard to get, even if you have your big Stanley Cup, it's hard to get your hydration goals in. So you're busy. So I hope you have a snack. I hope you have your hydration goals ready to be hit, because if you didn't get them done today, you can get them done while you're watching this. You need something to write on, maybe something to write with. And you can take notes on your phone, or you can take notes, on scratch paper, if you've taken down, if you've printed off the PowerPoint. But what I'd like you to do is, I'd like to sort of, not only get you ready with these recommendations and help you learn, but I'd like to sort of shrink the change. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when I'm doing 60 minutes or 90 minutes of a presentation like this, one of my recommendations is to look for one thing that you can use immediately. And the reason for that is that so often the 90 minutes goes by. If you're like me, you'll take copious notes. You might color code those notes, but then it gets buried under a pile of things, right? And so what I'd like to have you do is maybe even grab some sticky notes and just find one or two things. I'm happy for you. You have all the notes on the Padlet. You have this presentation. So hopefully you'll go back and you'll find more than one idea. But at the end of our time together, I'm going to say, what's one thing that you heard here that you can use almost immediately or immediately? And we're going to really be looking for that, so that you don't have to feel overwhelmed, and you can sort of target something that is, that's something what's accessible for you here. That's what we're looking for. So that is my recommendation. Take it or leave it, but I think that can be helpful. All right, without further ado, let's get started in talking specifically about co-teaching as it relates to students that might need a bit more in the way of support. And I'm starting out just by saying, why? If you have a free hand and you want to put a phrase into the chat, I would welcome it. But I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why co-teaching is a little bit different in these scenarios. So for example, I find, as a teacher who's done a lot of co-teaching, I find that, sometimes I have to stop what I'm doing, maybe at the front of the room, and I have to, support a student in a more direct way. That makes the co-teaching dynamic different sometimes. There might be more adults involved in the space, in our team, in our planning scenarios. If you have a free hand and you have a why for you is this different? Or maybe like, why did you come to this session? Have you noticed that there are some struggles, or that you've noticed that sometimes you have to have a different kind of conversation, or that your roles have to shift a little bit? Have you noticed anything that is just a little bit unique about this particular scenario of having kids with either extensive support needs, having kids that might have some behavior issues going on, where maybe there is a moment or several where the co-teaching starts to look a little bit different, or you need to kind of plan differently, or just have a mindset that's different? And I'll just kind of have a little hydration moment here just to see if anybody wants to share anything in the chat about what they have noticed. How is co-teaching different when you have kids with extensive support needs? Or maybe it's not. See if Janelle, I'm not seeing, we're not being flooded in the chat here. Oh, very good. Okay, Elizabeth is saving us from that really awkward moment. Yeah, the role switching. Elizabeth, that's really big for me, is really thinking about, well, the climate is one, and then having to in one moment say, oh, I'm going to, we planned this parallel lesson, and then 2 minutes later say, I guess I'm not going to be teaching in this parallel lesson. We're going to talk about that a little bit. I love Nicole's point. You have to be flexible, maybe more so than in other situations. Yeah, high levels of modifications are needed, potentially fewer on the spot kinds of planning moments. Absolutely. These are great responses, by the way. And you just kept me from kind of like being here by myself, having to make up, new ideas here. Yeah, and the need for remediation becomes evident when those gaps widen. So, when kids are in elementary school, we start to see after that first grade and second grade, and the conversation begins about, is inclusion appropriate for this learner? And oftentimes that happens because we don't know about what kinds of goals are appropriate for this learner. We don't have a shared story about what success looks like. And again, communication becomes a bigger issue because, again, the team is more extensive and the conversations have to go deeper. Great set of responses. Thank you for that. So that's exactly what I would say. And I'm going to talk to that in just a minute, but I want to tell you a story. And then I'm going to ask you if you can relate to this story. And it's okay if you can't. But I just want to give you a story about what a tension this becomes. Sometimes we need lots of support. Sometimes we have more wiggle room. So this is a story when I was teaching in an elementary school once, and I had a lot of kids with pretty unique needs in this school. And in one kindergarten classroom, I had a couple of kids in particular where I was a bit stumped, and I went to the principal one day and I said, I need help. I said, I don't know if I need more paraprofessional support or more adult support, or if I just need like a bigger conversation to happen, or if I just need some time, and if I just need my administrative team to give me some ways to think about this. But I really felt like I was, things were blurring for me. And so, my principal said, I'll come in and I'll do some, some observation, and we'll talk more about this. But I was really, really feeling kind of overwhelmed. Well, she came in, as promised, she came in, but she came in at the worst possible time, because after pouring my heart out and saying, we really need a lot of help, she comes in the next day to see a scene that was kind of confusing for her. And here's was a very beautiful classroom scene, a very common classroom scene. But we were in the kindergarten classroom, and we had, I was in the classroom that day for whatever reason. I wasn't always there at that time as an inclusion facilitator, but I was kind of visiting that day. We had two paraprofessionals in the classroom because of the needs of a few of the kids in the space. I think that day the speech pathologist was providing some support for a student and was in the space. And so what was happening was the teacher was doing a demonstration, and it was a bit of a last minute addition in our defense. But the teacher was doing a will it sink, will it float, because it related to a book that she was going to read. And so she had like a rubber ducky and a penny and a pencil and different things. And the kids were, of course, shouting out, will it sink, will it float? And this teacher was really energetic, really fun. She was making it like very exciting, will it sink, will it float? And the kids were sort of cheering. And all of us adults were sitting on the rug with the children, cheering right along with them, because Kathy was such a fun, energetic, and sort of a teacher that was magnetic in that sense. And so this lesson goes on, and all of these adults are sort of circling the rug, sitting next to learners, and we are just as enthusiastic as any of the students. And at this point, of course, my principal walks in, and what does she see? Again, this is just it's she's not seeing the larger picture, of course, right? But she happens to walk in when all the kids are beautifully engaged, and there are no fewer than 4 adults sitting and watching another adult engaging in this experience. And this went on for quite some time. Of course, all the students were just attending, shouting out answers. We had one student who was using augmentative communication to, vote on his responses, and it just looked picture perfect. But to this administrator, she kind of walked in, and I could see her starting to count all the adults' heads. Like, I don't think they need help, because there's a lot of adults in here, and this looks fine. And I think maybe they have too much support in this moment. And so as she walked out, I just remember looking at the speech pathologist, and we're like, we know that, this probably wasn't the ideal moment for her to do a little check-in assessment. So I don't know if this resonates with you or not. So I put this question up. Can you relate to this story at all? Have you ever had a moment where you knew in the moment there were probably better ways to use your staff, but in advance, you just didn't have the time or the wherewithal to make any of those changes? If you have ever had one of those moments where you're thinking, this is, we could probably do something different with the energy of these adults. We could probably do something different with the talent in this space. We could probably change up the groupings. We could probably make these constellations small. Okay, so there are some of you are saying, yes, I know what you're talking about. And in the same breath, and again, maybe if you haven't had that experience, you haven't, done a lot of facilitation, or you just haven't run into that, or you've been more conscientious with planning. There is no reason to feel shame in this story. It was more humorous than anything, right? And the principal understood that. She was a good principal. But the conversation we had later was not so much that this will never happen. Of course, moments like this will happen. It had not exactly been planned in the way that most lessons were planned. But what we came to was that, there were a lot of adults. Before we think about adding adults or changing up the supports for kids, let's actually look at the ways in which we can not only adapt when we are planful, but also could we adapt on the spot? Can we have a shorthand for this? Could we, if there was not time to go into a parallel lesson where I had a bucket and I was working with a small group to do sink or float, so more students' voices were on the table, right? If we didn't have time to do that, perhaps that would have been a nice time for one of us, whether it's Amy as a speech pathologist or for Paula as a teacher, to back up and do an observation anecdotally, to take some video at that moment to see what our students' behaviors, how our students were able to interact with their communication, grab some footage of the student interacting with those single message communication buttons. Might I take some data down? Might I simply do some observation for a while and even invite my colleague to switch out with me so she can do the same? So are there things that we can sort of talk about later where when we get into those situations where there's lots of adults in a more passive role, is there anything we can even do in the moment to shake things up? And so I thought we would lead with that to get us thinking a little bit about what, again, not only what is different when we're thinking about some of these kids, but also to think about, what are some of the preventative things that we can do to get into spaces like that a little less often? And then in addition, what are some proactive things that we can do so that we can think not just about our roles and relationship, but that we can just have a better conversation about the lessons themselves, right? So what's something I can immediately maybe shake up or change in a particular example? When we know we have our speech pathologist available, what are 3 different roles that she might take in addition to or instead of really kinds of direct supports? So those kinds of conversations are the things that we're going to talk about. So this bulleted list of 5, determining roles, expanding our teams, partnering with paras, looking at design for all, and adapting curriculum, instruction, and assessment. These are the 5 big ideas. And maybe at the end, one of these larger points will be your favorite idea. Maybe your favorite will be just a smaller strategy. So let's get started with determining roles. So this is something that Marilyn referenced in lots of ways. If you were at her sessions, you heard her talk about, having discrete roles. That, one of the misunderstandings of co-teaching is oftentimes that we have equal roles and that we are exactly the same. And Marilyn's really, really good about disrupting that there will be distinct roles for all adults in the classroom. And there is not only is there nothing wrong with that, but that's really necessary for a productive space and for us to be able to serve students in, not only with our instruction, with curriculum instruction, but for us to be able to respond to their individual needs. But one of the things I do want to talk about is how to think about role sharing and role swapping even. How is the idea of roles, how is it different when we have students with extensive support needs? And so very quickly, I think there are at least 3 differences. One is we may need to be a little bit more flexible. And some of you said that when I asked you for the differences, that sometimes you just have to shift gears immediately and you no longer can be somebody who's facilitating a station because a student needs us. That's true of all kids and all co-teaching relationships. It might be more true with a child with a health need, for example, or a behavioral need. More variety. And by what I mean by this, and we're going to talk about it, is we may need to invite in a wider range of folks, and that might come with the territory. For example, when we're working with kids with extensive support needs, we may be collaborating very regularly with a social worker, with a vision itinerant, with our speech pathologist. So there's going to be more variety just by the nature of student needs. And then more creativity. And I'm going to talk about that at the very end of our time, where actually midway also, but different ways to think about adapting these structures a little bit. We have to be inventive. And so when plan A doesn't work, do we have a plan B for collaborating and co-teaching? This starts with thinking about roles themselves. So I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about this idea of role sharing by talking about that idea of we're not going to be the same, but students should see us as equal in terms of we are both or all educators, right? So that part needs to be in place. And that's what, Marilyn and others would call having parity, or that sense of equity in the relationship. And if you feel that students do not see you as equals, then that's a time that you're going to be thinking about having this conversation about roles. Do they, call one teacher? I was in one school where one teacher was Miss Forrest and the other one they called by her first name. Because that had been a tradition in a special education classroom where there were only 7 students, and it was sort of a little bit more informal. So that really stuck out like a sore thumb, and it sort of added to that sense of, of these two are not, do not have that same relationship. I hate to use the word, but like the same relationship or sense of um, of ownership in the classroom around all learners and the curriculum and so on. So we want to say, do we have any evidence that students don't see both of us as teachers? I know when I was teaching kids and doing a lot of direct support, people would say, are you his mom? And I'm sure some of you have had that experience as well. Then you can ask yourself, what evidence do we have that students do see us, as educators in this space? You can actually have that conversation. What is your evidence for both questions? What's your evidence that students don't see you as equals, and what evidence do you have that they do? And then finally, how can you establish parity or this sense of equity when we don't have the same roles and responsibilities, right? They're going to see us doing different things at times, and when we have to do a lot of shifting. And so one of the things that we can do, and Marilyn with Lynn Cook established this terminology early on in the field, parity signals, right? And so you may have heard Marilyn talk about this idea of you want to send literally a signal to somebody else. We have this desire for learners to see us as a true team. So what can you do to that end? You can put the names on the board or on shared correspondence or on your your classroom website. You can talk about those shared roles at your open house with students and families. You can adapt the classroom so that you have workspaces, that look the same or nearly the same. The idea that we're going to say we and our versus yours and mine, that always helps. Using what I would call duet or team teaching sparingly but regularly. What does that mean? Well, when you are teaming at the front of the classroom and the two of you are delivering some instruction or doing morning announcements, one of the things that you heard from Marilyn is that's a structure that you want to use in small bits, right? That's not something that you want to use for big chunks of time. And it's not something that you want to use for entire lessons, certainly. However, for the sake of parity and communicating that, we are both or all your teachers, you want to use it regularly, maybe 5 minutes at the beginning of the lesson. Maybe you close out together each day by, one of you, take turns reading, an English teaching team that I worked with. They did Poems for Two Voices together on Fridays. Maybe at some point in the day, you do a community building on Friday mornings together. So they see you together a lot, but again, small bits of time. You want to think about attending student conferences together, those kinds of things. I will tell you that one of the things I noticed as a new teacher was that my colleagues who I was co-teaching with, they all, of course, were hosting conferences for students with disabilities. And so that those students would have their experience anchored, right inside that general education classroom. And of course, when those conferences came up, I, of course, attended as well. So both teachers were there for the conferences. But it occurred to me that I should be attending other student conferences as well when possible. So I told my colleague, I would like to go to other student conferences. We are a team after all. And even though I was in 4 and 5 different classrooms at that time and not a full day co-teacher, I found a couple of conferences that my colleague thought would be helpful just as a way of sending that message that we are teachers for all. In the book, we talk about creating a hybrid teaching name. So if Janelle and Paula are teaching together, I guess we'd be Paulelle, or what would be
Janella.
Bad Janella. That's the best one. That's very good. So you've probably seen some of these before, but if you have a free hand, if you could just throw into the chat, was there any here that you'd like to use more often, or maybe you use this a lot and it's important to you? So maybe you're somebody like, I feel like going to all students conference is important, or I feel like making sure that we're doing a lot of assessment together or maybe that you are using a lot of the language changes as a signal, and you're really conscientious about that. Maybe you're really good about talking about shared roles. I know that's a big one that lots of us, especially that are new co-teachers, telling folks, talking about your students, your classroom as a team can educate others in the building about that relationship. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so if you are, depending on your schedule, in some instances, you can do all of those shared activities, like all of the conferences. You can do, for some of you, it might be that you are, if you are in a space all day long, it will be really thinking about analyzing, every space where there is a single teacher's, potential image or shared language and names, to really do some deep dives on that and make sure that the names of both teachers, that it's shared. And so whether that's on report cards or whether that's on the door, folks are seeing that, and we're educating, especially if you are the only co-teacher in the building or you're one of few. Love these responses. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, just the language itself. And that's something that others may notice as well. Again, it's a way of educating others. And that's really important because in many instances, this is new to folks and they haven't seen that maybe they haven't seen some of that signaling before. So we're educating everybody about what these relationships can look like, and it can help us think differently about those roles, which is really nice. Okay. So Terry has a question. Do you recommend that the special educator attends all of the other conferences of students without disabilities? Terry, I wouldn't have been able to. If you are a lot of you are co-teaching on the fly, I'm just assuming. So if you are in, I was maybe co-teaching here in the morning, here in the afternoon, I would be a chunk of time in second grade, and I was in 6 different grade levels, not always co-teaching. That's not unusual. I think a lot of folks think it's unusual, but it's not. In a high school, it would be absolutely impossible. So I think if you are full-time co-teaching or half-day co-teaching and you can do those kinds of things, I think it sends a powerful message. I think it's just important to have the conversation with your teacher, with your co-teaching partner, and say, well, what's reasonable? Because there might be other important things that you both need to get done. What's reasonable? And how can we sort of make some choices that not just send a positive message, but remember, these are professional development moments as well, because we're both learning about not only our students in these ways can expand our skill set, but it's an important way to communicate and educate our families as well. So good question. Be different for every team. All right. So one of the tools that you're going to get is a co-teaching roles and responsibilities checklist from my book. And so that's on the Padlet. And so we're not going to go through all of this, but again, just very quickly, how this might be different for kids with certain disabilities is you can see on the chart that we have a column on the far right. So there's a role and responsibility on the left of the chart. And then there's a column for general ed teacher, and there's a column for special ed teacher. And so a lot of these kinds of tools will have you indicate who is going to write the IEP, who is maybe both of us, maybe it's one of us, who is primarily going to make phone calls to families about additional meetings. Is that both of us? Is that one of us? Are we taking turns? So that's pretty typical. But if you go to that last column, we have this column for other, because a lot of you working with these kinds of learners, you will need to have a paraprofessional in there, maybe an occupational therapist that you're working with, ELL teacher. Who else are you working with who might need to take on some of these roles? So I want you to think about that. Take a look at that and see if it's any different than other tools that you've looked at. And the other thing I want you to consider is that when you have kids where there's a bit more to plan around, you're going to have to go beyond things like designing assessments and adapting materials and integrating IEP objectives. You might be thinking about things like who's designing augmentative and alternative communication supports, who's going to meet with the executive functioning coach who's giving us, guidance and feedback. If you have a doctor that's giving you, some notes or some follow-up, is there one of you that will be responsible for that more than the other? And of course, the answer is very likely. So there might be roles that you're typically not thinking about when these learners are involved. Working with paraprofessionals themselves, who is going to do primary supervision and give feedback? In some, hopefully both of you, but one of you may step forward and do a bit more of that, just based again on what is most pressing and what's most appropriate. So that's one tool that you can consider. The other thing I wanted to share with you is that once you have created that, these questions are actually on the bottom of this tool. What you can see 4 questions there on the very bottom of that form. And these are the questions. Once you're completing, once you're finished with it, you're going to ask, how do these roles look? Did you get through it? And somebody's going, I'm really unsure about that because I don't have any experience, with this role that we've decided I'm going to take on. Okay, let's talk about that. After looking at this and seeing, looks like the general ed teacher is really loaded up. Do we have to change anything? Will anyone need support to adopt these roles? So actually these roles seem appropriate to us, but is the paraprofessional ready to take on that particular responsibility? And then another question to consider is, what messages are these decisions sending to our sort of stakeholders around us? Are we really traditional in how we're thinking about this, or are we trying to shake things up a little bit? Are these roles allowing us to grow a little bit and learn some new skills? So one of the things I want you to consider after all of that is, do you need a shakeup? And look at this cute dog. He clearly does. And you might too. And so one of the things that Julie and I talk about is you might need a shakeup if you are engaged in roles the same way that you were engaged in them the semester before and the year before and the quarter before that. Do you need to do something different? And here are some indicators that maybe you do. Number 1 is the general ed teacher on your team never gets a chance to work individually with students with disabilities. That may not be a primary role, but it should be a regular role. The special educator, multilingual teacher, enrichment teacher is not planning or teaching any whole class lessons, or scarcely doing those things. Team teaching, co-teaching, and sort of serving in some of those lead roles. Related services are rarely invited to teach in the classroom or develop curriculum. So if you've got one of these therapists that we've talked about, an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, and you're not bringing them in these ways, that might be a shakeup moment, right? The only role of the paraprofessional in your classroom is to offer direct services. We're going to talk about that tonight. Students do not have leadership roles, and they are never asked to present lessons with one another or with their teachers. We want to bring them forward in the name of UDL. We want them to become expert learners, and that includes kids with disabilities, right? And then a little point of humor from me and from Julie. You know that you need to shake things up if the kids say, hey, we're kind of bored with how you're defining roles and responsibilities. Can we jazz things up around? I don't know if your kids would say that, but if they do, it probably is a signal. So that's number 1, is really thinking about roles and responsibilities. Take a sip of your water. I want you to hydrate. We need a hydrated audience. We want to, we can pause here. Janelle, I see you have a...
Yeah, we have someone in the chat who has their hand raised, so I just wanted to see if there was a question that we could answer. Don't know if that was sometimes that happens on accident.
Yes, maybe there was just some shaking going on because I was talking about shaking it up. I don't know.
I think that might be it. I'll let you know. I'll let you know if a question comes in.
Let me know. Okay, good. All right. So if one of the ideas here might be your idea, jot that down. Get your pencil out, jot it down. See my enormous pencil as my prop. Okay. And let's move on to the second big idea. So second big idea is one I think that's really going to resonate with lots of you. And that is, how can we creatively partner with our paras in these spaces? So I brought you this visual. If you have ever observed a classroom where you have seen this kind of energy, certainly I have, where it feels like the paraprofessional is kind of feeling like the odd one out. Just put a yes in the chat if you have ever observed in a classroom. Maybe you've been a paraprofessional, maybe you are a paraprofessional, or you can see how this could happen, especially in a co-talk, right? Because it changes the energy. Lydia, me too. And I didn't see that a lot yet. Nicole's given me a yes. Yes, this is not as common, I think, in other instances. But once we get into co-teaching, it's kind of like three's a crowd, right? Gina says it happens. So we want to make sure it doesn't happen because this resource is far too valuable to us. And so this starts with, I don't think you have this slide, but I put this in because it just starts with relationships, right? It starts with how we're positioning this. And again, especially in a co-taught classroom, we want to make sure that we are elevating all roles. So here's what we don't want to do. This is Mr. Ruiz. He will be working with Luz. No, we do not want that. So this is already setting us up to say not true partners, right? How about this is Mr. Ruiz. He is another one of the educators in our room. He will be supporting you, helping with activities, and collaborating with us all year long. Absolute truth in that statement. And that's how we want to position all adults, even though paraprofessionals, as Marilyn always points out, we're not co-teaching as it is defined. We are co-teaching by definition is with certified professionals, certified personnel. However, there's so much that paraprofessionals can do to make a co-taught classroom so much richer. So what is the role of the paraprofessional when they support students with extensive or complex support needs? I'm glad that you asked because the answer is it is ever changing and evolving. I don't know if you watch the Super Bowl and you might, this is a picture of Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, and she's whispering in his ear at the Super Bowl. And I don't know if you saw this image, but you might not have known what she was saying. And what she was saying was, paraprofessional priorities are actually always shifting. And that's why we can't exactly answer that question. There is an evolution, right? That is for sure. So I want you to remember that. And one of the things I want you to think about is that, of course, the number one priority absolutely is the student. So when the student needs that kind of support, we have to be there for that learner. Absolutely. But beyond that, we want to have this bigger conversation about that might not always be necessary and needed in a particular moment. And even when we have a handful of moments, even when we have some unexpected time to be supporting a student, we have to be really clever and creative about how we think about supporting not just students, but our paraprofessionals. So there's two ideas that we are going to look at related to paraprofessionals. One is moving beyond one-to-one, and then talking about how we can, create a more satisfying situation by informing, coaching, assessing, and repeating. All right, so the first thing to think about is moving beyond one-on-one. And so what I mean by that is even for kids with high needs, there will be moments when we can back away from an individual and we can back away from really proximal support. And so this is, again, the student is always the first priority, right? We're not saying that we're going to walk away from somebody that really needs assistance or somebody that's struggling. So that will always be number one, but we have to have a conversation about how can all adults take on really valued roles in our classrooms in every single instance. And at the same time, how can we move away from proximal support that isn't always needed, right? And so this serves us in two ways, doesn't it? It helps the learner because too much of the wrong kinds of proximal support can cause all kinds of problems. Students lose agency. They may not have a good sense of what they can do independently or being, interdependence, relying on interdependence with other students. We may interfere with the interactions with students. We may interfere with the interactions with teachers and students. And so there's all kinds of challenges there. So beyond instructional roles, one of the things I would really love for you to consider if, or bring to other folks is in every single collaborative classroom where paraprofessionals are supporting kids, we should see them in a variety of roles, even if those roles have to change. We should see folks doing things like maybe taking the attendance. Maybe they lead the daily brain break. Maybe they're one that reads some of the announcements. Maybe they are the ones that post the mental math challenge. Maybe they share that poem of the day instead of the two teachers at the end. Maybe they facilitate a review game on Fridays. Looking for places where that individual can take over a repetitive task, greeting students at the door, Now our teachers are free to engage in a whole host of behaviors. They can do check-ins with kids. They can engage in some observation. They might be able to, deal with a particular challenge that's happening around a learner. They can have a quick 5-minute meeting together on the fly. So, and it also sends a powerful message to all kids that all of these adults are here for all of the learners. So that's one thing to think about is in my classroom, what kinds of these sort of auxiliary roles and community roles do our paraprofessionals have? So if I walk through at any point in time, am I seeing all kinds of adults taking on different roles as a way to communicate that message? Of course, there's also instructional roles that will be at play. So paraprofessionals, this is, I don't think uncommon, but I think it can be helpful to think about if you haven't shaken up some of those roles in a while, what roles can folks take on? Can they facilitate a small group? That sink and float example, had we done some pre-planning, that's a role with a lesson plan that a paraprofessional could have had a small group, I could have had a small group, and the teacher could have had a small group, right? That if the kids are in book clubs, a paraprofessional might be doing direct support of an individual student, but they might also have 2 or 3 students where they are helping to facilitate and ask questions to those learners. Station teaching, we can have paraprofessionals facilitating stations. They might be the ones that are, creating that, I don't know, say sounding the chime so that we know when we are moving from station to station. They might be the one that's encouraging learners to get set up with the next activity. They also might be at a station presenting an activity. They might have students creating something with materials. So potentially you might have kids who are building, in a classroom, kids are building landforms with Play-Doh. A paraprofessional might be somebody who is going to be at a station leading an activity, creating space for teachers to then have other roles. Maybe you want a teacher who's going to be engaged in the facilitation so that that person can engage in some data collection. So that person can do sort of follow a student with a disability who they think is going to need a little bit more assistance, get a feel for that level of support. Maybe a general ed teacher who never gets to do that wants to be in that role where a special ed teacher and a paraprofessional are going to be stationed at a few tables running activities. And then finally, assessment and skill practice. What if we have a student who, you have a learner, as paraprofessional, who is pulling individual students and having flashcard practice in a moment. You may have a paraprofessional who is walking around and jotting down observations during writer's workshop. This has to, of course, be set up by teachers, but these are all things that will grow the skill set of that person, and also, again, help teachers shift into other roles, even if just for small moments. So I want to say one more thing about some auxiliary roles, and it's not really right inside of those parameters, but you are going to get a sheet about one teach, one make, multisensory. So this is a structure that you don't see named in lots of places, but Julie and I like to give this idea of illustrating concepts its own name. So you might think of this as one teach, one assist, but with a little bit of flair. So you have this in the Padlet, and this is another great role that's instructional at the core for some of our paraprofessionals. So if you can't think of ways, always to be really planful about a particular time and space in a lesson, or it just comes upon you too quickly, you could have some shorthand, and maybe that paraprofessional knows if the student is actually doing okay and they're watching the demonstration of will it sink, will it float, maybe I can come up to the front of the classroom and I can start charting what floated and what sank. Maybe as the teacher is explaining what's happening, I can be the one assisting with the demonstration and setting up all the materials. Maybe I could be the one for what will it sink or will it float. I can actually cue the students with and without disabilities to use the augmentative communication option if they would like to. And so this might involve holding up props during a lesson. It might involve adding a little bit of music. I work with a team where the one teacher has the vocabulary word and the other one has them sort of sing it out while they strum a guitar. It might be that one teacher's got puppets while the other teacher's telling a story. Again, most of these are entirely appropriate for a paraprofessional to, whether in the moment or with some planning, come on up and assist during a mini lesson or even just an instructional moment. So these are all things, if we're not seeing the paraprofessionals in our space as able to do this, one of the time savers that you can think about is, well, there's 5 ideas that we like here. And we now know over time and working together that when one is maybe engaged in a demonstration, if the other one is available, maybe our para, they will jump up and start recording some of this information on a dry erase board, or they might start sketching, doing some sketching of the story, or doing some diagramming of what's being taught. And those are things we can go into even with, within just a moment's notice. So those are all options. And maybe for some of you, that's a takeaway. You're thinking, well, that's an idea that might work for me. Let me show you one more idea with paras, and then we'll talk about, we'll take a minute for a question. The second idea, so now we're thinking about what are paras actually doing in the classroom? The other way to really make the most out of your team is I would implore you to take some time to inform, coach, assess, and then repeat. What do I mean by that? Take some time to really do a lot of observation of your paras, let them observe you. Even if it's just 15 minutes, I had a team of 9 once, and sometimes I could meet with folks just for a handful of minutes a month, and we would pick an activity that we thought could move the relationship and the teaching forward. I might observe them as they engage in something new. They're facilitating peer tutoring. I might want to watch what that looks like. I might want to assess their work and provide feedback. So I might kind of take a look at where they are with a certain skill, and either in writing or just right in the moment, talk about some changes. And I might even kind of flip in and say, would you like to watch me try this? So I think it's really important that all of the paras get to watch you and your co-teacher work with students. We never want somebody to try something that they've never seen. And for some skills, they might need to see that multiple times. But keep in mind, it might be just as important. Again, I should say, they should get to observe us and we should be observing them. But don't forget that we need some clarity on feedback as well. So you're going to get a couple of tools to that end. And maybe this is one of your favorite ideas. You're going to get a tool of paraprofessional support. This is just something I use when I have a paraprofessional who's trying to fade off of a lot of direct support. They're looking for guidance on that. They're looking for ways to move away from the student side, even for small bits. Maybe it's something that we're working on as I'm watching them or they're watching me. And so this assessment is something that you can sort of identify tasks during the day that require a little bit of movement. You can identify what are some difficulties. You can look at the current level of support, and then together you can talk about where would you like to be? What strategies do you want to use? Do you want to take some data? Do you want to teach the student new skills? Do you want to look to families, for advice and guidance? But there's all kinds of things that you might do to move away from those more kind of traditional scenarios. The other tool that you might consider is a lesson plan. And we don't see this often, but this is a specific plan for paraprofessionals. And I just want you to take a look at this. Again, you have this page in the Padlet. This won't be necessary in lots of instances, but if you are running from classroom to classroom, like I was as a teacher, I often wasn't there to give really subtle cues about move away, come back in, shift your level of support, now give a verbal cue. If you're not needed, try this. I wasn't always there. So I often, for at least a while, at least for new activities, I would actually write out and document what an ideal level of support would be for students. So on this particular plan, the support plan, the paraprofessional is reading, while we're on Monday and Tuesday, while we're doing storytelling, would you draw out the story as we're reading? That would be really helpful. When we're working on Wednesday at story time, we're actually going to break into smaller groups. And each of us are going to have a small group and read this book. On Thursday and Friday, we're going to do the read aloud alone as co-teachers. Could you go ahead and work on some classroom materials, some differentiation supports, if these kids don't need really direct support? And so on and so forth. And again, over time, you might not need that level of specificity, but especially in the beginning of the year for repetitive tasks, it can really take away a lot of guesswork and anxiety and difficulties and misunderstandings. So once we have clarified what's helpful, we can go back and make sure that everyone's understanding what the goal is and how this team can kind of work together. All right, so thinking of those two big areas, so one is the roles and responsibilities, and this other big area, bulky area, was paraprofessionals. I think we have a couple of questions coming in, so let's go back to that. And it could be a question about the tools, how I've used them. Do you have paraprofessionals assigned to the co-taught classroom? We only have them if they are working one-on-one with a student per IEP, but not additional paras. Yes. So this is really common. The paraprofessionals that I typically would work with were seen as one-on-ones or were seen as direct support paras because of the needs of the students. What we found, though, over time was that it's often really hard on learners to have a lot of proximal support. And actually, it may not always be healthy for one-on-one to mean I'm sitting right next to that learner. One-on-one often means that this first priority of this adult is this individual, but that does not mean that we can't look at what is in the best interest of this individual. It might mean getting materials set up for that next segment. It might mean facilitating a peer interaction. It might mean, moving away from that student and doing some observation in the classroom at this time so that I'm not adjacent that individual and I can sort of very quickly jot down how we're doing with our fading plan. So it varies, of course, by district and student, but some of these roles could be in play no matter what the situation is. And so that requires dialogue with the team, of course, and with administrators. Just going to go back and see if there's anything else. So here's the question that I initially saw from Natalie. How can I plan lessons for the general ed class when I have 5 preps and I also have my caseload of IEPs? The general ed class. Well, this kind of goes a little bit beyond what I've covered so far, but one of the things that you might want to think about if you are in a lot of different spaces, you have students in a lot of different spaces, and you're just kind of more doing a floating, like you're kind of floating in and out of spaces, and you're more doing lesson design with folks, is you'll have to do probably you might have to do some of this where you're doing some thinking about what are some repetitive structures in that classroom. And so how are you thinking about the planning in this particular instance for paraprofessionals? For designing lessons themselves, and you've got lots of different preps. Some folks do a lot of front loading. So they'll do almost like month by month or even quarter by quarter where they'll do a bigger prep time. And they'll just sort of look at general supports for kids and think about how they can integrate some of those same supports throughout different units. Other teams will do, again, sort of just a lot of repetition so that they will have times that folks can come in and have reliable moments of collaboration and co-teaching. So for example, I always talk about planning and patterns. And so if I'm not going to be in your math class very much, it'll really help a lot if we're going to do stations on Fridays and mostly on Fridays, and we try to keep that pattern in place for a while, because if we know what kinds of materials that we typically put in our stations, and we typically know what our roles are, and we typically know how we're planning for, say, our para, those kinds of roles and that kind of structural stuff can already be in place. So any kind of patterning like that you can do over time is really helpful, especially if you're going to have moments in the classroom where you are co-teaching. The more repetition that you can have and the more sort of predictability in the planning, that's going to be an asset to your team so that you can do more than just potentially design, and you can also get in there and do some collaborative work with teachers and with students as well. All right, I'm going to keep moving here just to make sure that we get through some of the smaller ideas here. They're all important. But But I just want to end this one with saying paraprofessionals, one of the things that we probably don't talk about enough is that it's really great to bring cookies. It's really great to do all those things. And I don't know a single paraprofessional that says, yes, bring me a coffee. I love it. It makes me feel great, right? But this idea of having a bigger conversation about roles, having meaning in the classroom, making sure that everybody feels that they are making a true contribution, all of those kinds of conversations, those are gifts to our teams. And so if we like a lot of pairs will say, like, training to them and getting feedback, like, I got to watch you and you watched me. We had a conversation about what I was doing right. You gave me really some good tips about how I could try something new. That for a lot of folks is gold. And so thinking about, is there a way, even in the smallest bits of time, that we can bring more of that into our spaces and into our relationships with these really important members of our team. Before I talk a little bit more about the team, I would love to just have you so far, if you're writing something down, here's my massive pencil prop. If you have an idea so far, if you have a big idea yet, is there anything so far that you're thinking, I like that, I think I could follow up on that? Is there a resource? Do you like the idea of thinking about that, maybe that plan for paraprofessionals? Do you like the idea of being more clear about fading? Are you thinking bigger about your roles and responsibilities? Do you want to shake things up with related services? If you haven't written anything so far, just take a moment, hydrate, take a drink. What's so far something that you can use? Whitney says defining roles and responsibilities. Excellent. What else is coming up for you? So we want to make sure that you walk away with something that is useful, that can be immediately applicable. We want to make sure there's access here for you. What else is hitting for you, especially in terms of maybe passing this on to somebody else? Yeah, fading the para support. And then instead of, oftentimes we'll just say, we got to fade back. This isn't healthy for kids. Okay, but what do we do? And so some of these ideas will help you to answer that question. Yeah, Julie, it's so true. We have such small bits of time. I'm going to say this. Don't ever turn up your nose at just even 10 minutes, because I know you don't have more than 10 minutes sometimes. So even if it's just every now and then, and just making that like discreet, it's like, I'm going to check in with this para at this, this week for this handful of minutes, and this para this week for a handful of minutes, even small bits of time, and just picking one small thing to look at, to examine, to consider. And even if it's just that, I'm going to be in that classroom for a few minutes. Let's make this a quick observation. Watch what I do. Let me know if you have a question, right? Even if it's a small bit of time, it can be powerful. I appreciate what you're saying. All right, so let's take a look at expanding the team, because this might be something that you can add to your conversations with, that you're having around paras. Is it's not just going to be about paras. There's a whole host of folks that might be contributing to the success that you're building for kids with and without disabilities. I put this little cue in here about this little red beanbag chair, because I always remember that it was a librarian in my first school who figured out, from observing a student of mine, she figured out that she could teach him that when he didn't have a lot of reliable ways to communicate. So she taught him to find the red beanbag chair in the library when he was ready to listen to a story. And so she put a lot of books that he liked near that red beanbag chair. She modeled for, reading other kids' stories in that beanbag chair. And over the course of time, she figured this out through collaboration with his mother, how to have this child use that moment of taking a seat as almost an augmentative communication, indicator. This is, I'm ready for story time. And that was like such a learning, a sort of an aha for me, because I began to ask her for her assistance in other spaces. I mean, she couldn't leave the library. She couldn't exactly co-teach with me much in other places. But I realized that for kids with these needs, I had to really lean into every single adult in that building. So I want to talk about that for a moment, about how looking at all the adults in the spaces adds support to our classroom, right? If we can expand the team and say, what can Kathy, the librarian, help, in terms of our co-teaching team, and give us ideas and help to, draft off of her, her strategies. It also provides on-the-spot professional development. If I bring a therapist into my classroom, even a physical therapist into physical education, I'm learning something about what that student needs. I'm learning from that person, and I'm able potentially to use those techniques down the road. Finally, I can do some different things across co-teaching structures. So maybe it's hard for me to, again, run that parallel lesson because I might have to sort of jump out of it at any point. But if I have another adult in the classroom at times, that person may be able to support that individual student, or may be able to take over in a co-teaching moment, run that parallel lesson. So one of my favorite things to say about this is, one of the ways to think about growing that team and embracing this is to consider that 100% in an inclusive school, 100% of the adults should be there for 100% of the kids. This is not to say everyone's equal, they have the same skill set, they have the same roles, but what it means is that every single adult should have that intention that we are all there to support. So I have a couple of pictures here that I thought you might get a kick out of. This is a picture of a school secretary. I've always used the school secretary. Again, we need lots of creativity for this group of kids, right? So our school secretary, Ruth, she was always supporting kids. We had a student who was working on a literacy goal. So we made Bob he was sort of like the unofficial class correspondent in a 6th grade. And every day we asked him to email the school secretary a question. It helped him with writing skills. We could keep the product and we could sort of look at his progress over time. We would cue Ruth about what kinds of questions to send. She loved it. She worked on greetings with a little girl named Tamika. Tamika was so shy when she first came, and not only was Ruth willing to work on these greetings with Mika, but she was taking some informal data as well. If she greeted Mika, did Mika greet her back? Was it in an audible voice, and so on? We had a recycling club at the school for a student who needed a lot of movement breaks. So he would leave and he would sort of grab the recycling, with a classmate, and they would bring it down to Ruth. And she made it official. She created a poster, with where she would track how much they recycled. She sort of gave dignity to that experience. So this is not co-teaching in the ways in which we're talking about, in our sessions with Marilyn. But what I'm saying is, when you've got kids with high needs, you have to think about the potential of every adult in the building to give you that edge and to provide these kinds of experiences for kids that can not only add to comfort and security, but also can add to academic growth and beyond. Here is a building security officer in a Chicago public school. He started teaching chess to 4 kids at lunch, and his club grew in a month to 14 kids. These kids learned a range of skills. It was an inclusive chess club. And we learned a lot from Mr. Adams, because he just had a very laid back style. Students sort of interacted with him in some really unique ways. He didn't bring a lot of baggage to his interactions with learners, because he didn't know them at that level. So he was teaching kids chess that I think a lot of teachers thought that would be really hard for that kid to learn chess. And so having him involved really helped us to modify, our ideas about, who these learners are, and helped us to see, of course, the value of everybody in our building in a different way. So this might be our occupational therapists, our speech therapists, our physical therapists, our social workers, our vision itinerants, our mobility instructors, and so on and so forth. Do you team with anybody on this list, or somebody else and if so, do your students have needs? Maybe it's somebody that's not on this list. But if you team with somebody on this list, throw it in the chat. I'd love to know if there's anybody here who is, somebody that you've done a lesson or two with. Yeah. It's so true that a lot of this might be, every now and then, and there's nothing wrong with that. This might not be something that you are doing on the regular. It might be something that you're doing every now and then. It might be something that you're doing twice a year, just as a way to expand, again, your own skill set and to send a message about your willingness to team. And it can also be a really lovely way to convey that 100% for 100% with all the students, right? Every adult here has something to offer our students. Anybody else that works with, do you collaborate or co-teach with anybody on this list? If you work closely with folks on this list, but you're not collaborating and co-teaching, maybe your wheels are turning and you're thinking, could there be somebody here that I could co-teach even a single lesson with in this semester? Just get my feet wet as a way to, again, grow those skills. Great, Terry. Yeah, counselors, excellent. Some people work with nurses on, like, again, even a single lesson. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I love it. The custodian co-dedicated the school garden. Awesome example. Behavior folks, Scott, absolutely. Let me just wet your whistle with a couple of examples. And again, don't get overwhelmed that this has to be like every single week, but I just want to get you thinking about what it looks like to bring these folks in somewhat on the regular. This is a second grade example. We had I worked in a second grade with a student that had a vision itinerant. So he had really low vision. And we liked Debbie, and she occasionally came to planning. So we wanted to include her, and we said, we're doing a lesson about the senses. What a perfect lesson for you to come on in and do a parallel lesson. So as one second grade teacher can be teaching about like the human eye in this example. And Debbie's like, I have so many great tools because of my work. So she came in and she brought these models, and both teachers were able to use these really cool models that Debbie had. And she was able to work with this particular student, Patrick, of course, in her group. And the second grade teacher had a group as well. And the students get to know what Debbie's work is and found that interesting. Well, we thought, well, that's probably the only lesson that makes sense. So that we'll leave that there. And then Debbie said, I can work in other literacy lessons because I can introduce some tools to students. What a great idea. So, we had a lesson where students were just doing some discussion and they were looking at the textbook. So Debbie came in and she ran a small group, short discussion on something in the science class. And she, at that same time, modeled the use of a slant board. Why is Joe using a slant board? Another day, she had kids were looking at text and she brought some magnifiers. So Joe really needed those tools, but it became a way for, for her to kind of show off those technologies and for them to become kind of normed in the classroom. We found that other kids profited from some of those tools as well. So there was sort of a UDL moment there too. She engaged in no more than one lesson a month. And so we discovered this mid-year, so maybe 4 or 5 times. We tried this out and ended up being a really nice growth opportunity for the staff. And I think obviously for the students as well. There's another example. This is a 9th grade English example. This is a speech pathologist. And our speech pathologist was so fantastic. She was really savvy. I'm going to call her Sam. And what she would do is she would find, she really liked co-teaching. She found that kids were more likely to want to work with her. And she found oftentimes that kids didn't like to, work with her, and they didn't want to be with an adult and they didn't want to feel different. So she'd have a hard time getting kids to sort of come to speech. And so what she did was she started coming and working on the stations with us. And so she would once or twice a month in this English ELA classroom, she would come to a station and she would, again, she would present materials. She might teach students usually something that had to do with writing or vocabulary, something that she was, sort of versed in. One of the first lessons was students had a writing task, and she showed them how they might want to use something like speech to text. She said some kids really need it. Other kids might want to use it to get over a writer's block. Another time she played a vocabulary game with kids. And at the same time, she was able to show students how a student's assistive augmentative and alternative communication, how their device worked, and she could access that vocabulary as she was teaching this vocabulary game. So she loved coming in, and the students really oftentimes were intrigued by material that she would share. even if it's only once a semester, we are giving kids that window into not only these tools, again, think about universal design for learning, where learners may learn something that may be useful to them as individuals, but it's also helping us as educators integrate some of those recommended tools into our instruction, because I can see how she's talking about the tool. I can see how kids are using it. I can see how other kids are reacting to it. And now we have students as partners as well, because they've seen some of these tools. So in this particular classroom, they had a fairly static kind of station model. They always had a 9th grade teacher who was engaged in some kind of a writing lesson that was really direct. The special ed teacher, sometimes that was me, was a facilitator. Usually the speech pathologist was at one station. The students usually did some text analysis at a station, and sometimes they did sort of a flipped lesson, or they watched a video at a different station. And to keep the planning manageable for a long time, those stations stayed fairly static. Always a lesson from the teacher, always the special ed teacher facilitating, always a flipped lesson or a video to view, usually some kind of text analysis, and then usually Amy showing off a tool. So these are that repetition is what I mean by planning and patterns. And it's another way to involve folks in somewhat of a unique way. I want to just pair this with this next idea, and then I'll sort of pause and see what you're taking away. Adapting the structures is another way that you might think about when you think about expanding the team. When you're thinking about some of these learners, how can we tweak what we already know to be best practice? And so as you're considering the individuals kind of being tweaked, in other words, bringing more folks into the classroom or bring folks in a different way, like Nicole's talking about the librarian and Scott talked about behavior specialists, we can also think about, while these folks are coming in, we can also change what these structures look like. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. And for some of you, this might be a takeaway, because it's something that you can do without really much planning. Some adjustments that we can make. If you're using something like one teach, one float, or one teach, one assist, one of the accommodations that I might make is to think about creating a more, what's the word I want? A more meaningful role for the person who is assisting or floating. So I always say, when you're floating, are you floating with a purpose? And one way to do that is I'm giving you a handout from my book, Universal Design Daily. An example that you're going to get from that book is that one of the things that we might do is, while one person is floating, when we're teaching kids with lots of needs, it might not be enough just to check in with kids. We might need to be looking at a student with, in a really kind of keen way. So this is an example of a student with extensive support needs, who's in a kindergarten morning meeting. We're not seeing lots of evidence of participation. And gradually over time, that learner was able to show some engagement, like they would look at the teacher, or they could raise a hand or vocalize. This particular team did not notice this with the naked eye, but because one of the team members was video recording with an iPad for a few minutes a day, when they started to look at the footage, they began to see that that learner was indeed making some progress. So that's an example of kind of floating with a purpose. When you're floating, are you just checking in with kids? Are you just observing? Or are you saying, should I be engaged in data collection? Should I be checking in with a couple of individual students? Should I at this time be looking at, in one classroom, it might be that I'm walking around and I'm gathering information about a particular skill, like how many students were able to sort of get started without any prompting. Are you floating with some kind of a goal in mind? You might not do that every time, but that might be more necessary when you have certain learners in this space. Parallel teaching is another change. Some changes that you can make are in this realm of parallel teaching, right? One of the changes that I use a lot is uneven group sizes. So what I mean by that is that we often will have, you have 15, I have 15, you have 12, and I have 12. It's usually even groups. But if you've got some kids in your classroom that have higher needs, one teacher might have 8 students, while the other group, has 14. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're not ability grouping, as long as those are heterogeneous groups. that can be really a helpful way to adapt a parallel structure. It's also really helpful if a group has to go in the hallway and you don't have lots of space. Work that way too. The uneven group sizes is only one accommodation. The other thing you can do is to keep some groups the same over time. So you can save some time there. If you feel this is an overwhelming structure, what you might want to do is, I worked in one 8th grade classroom, and every time they went into a parallel structure for a discussion, they not only had a bigger group and a smaller group, but they kept those groups static for a while so that students kind of got used to the kids in their discussion group, and it felt a little bit easier, I think a little more accessible, a little safer for certain kids. Station teaching adjustments. You might have to get creative here. You could get creative with student support. So you might have station repetition. If I am the one that is leading a station and the student needs a lot of support from me today, I might have that student repeat that station 3 times instead of go to 3 different stations. For some kids, that's entirely appropriate. Maybe they get the vocabulary lesson 3 times, or they get the computation lesson 3 times, and we already have a satisfying way of adapting that. Station teaching is also having a plan B for your adult roles. If you feel like, oh, I like using one teach, one make multisensory, I like coming up and being able to have have another mode of representation in my lessons, but sometimes I have to scoot because a student needs me. What's your plan B? Maybe a paraprofessional takes over. Maybe some of those roles can be taken over by students, especially at older elementary, middle school, high school. So we teach kids how to sort of, maybe it's you're sketchnoting as the teacher is teaching, and over the course of time you teach many learners how to sketch note so that anybody can come up, and that can be part of your plan B. So those are just things that I think some teachers have used. And it's a way to make co-teaching still work when you may be struggling and thinking, for the kids that I have this year, I could never use stations, right? I could never use that particular idea. Of these 3, is there anything that you could see trying? Could you see the floating with a purpose? Could you see trying the uneven group sizes if needed? Could you see using station repetition? Could you see subbing in some, plan B adult roles? If you have a free hand, which one of those are you thinking, I haven't tried that one, I could try it? Take a little sip of water. We need you hydrated to the end. Anything here? What are you thinking about? Anything hitting you for this one? Yeah, maybe, and thinking about that uneven. Yeah, remember, you still want to have heterogeneous groups, right? But you can have uneven groups, absolutely, and still make that work for the sake of, again, accessibility and even comfort. Yeah, trying the stations and potentially even thinking differently about maybe some students skip the station. Maybe, maybe some students skip certain stations. I've even been in classrooms where there's some choice stations so that some learners with disabilities, there's a wider range of activities that match.
And Paula,
Excellent.
there was a question that came up earlier about pacing in the general curriculum. So if a teacher teaches in some sessions or some class periods are co-taught and others are not, what are your recommendations around pacing to ensure that the level of rigor is not changing?
Yeah, so when it's co-taught and when it's not, I think you can follow some of these same kinds of recommendations, right? Like you have to have that plan B. So I work with a lot of folks that will say, well, we could never in this classroom do the parallel because sometimes, these preps, but sometimes we have an adult and sometimes we don't have an adult. And so in one classroom I work in, what they did was they had a paraprofessional available when they didn't have a teacher available. So instead of just doing 2 parallel lessons, 2 teachers doing the same thing, what they did was they had almost 2 stations. They had one that became a review station where the adult simply had to sort of facilitate and check in on learners, where the teacher in a smaller group directly taught a lesson. And then midway through, they switched groups. The paraprofessional was still in that sort of supervisory facilitation role. They weren't directly teaching a lesson. In the other classrooms, however, that parallel lesson was taught differently, where when there were two teachers available, they split the lesson, and then for a shorter period of time, they directly taught the lesson, and then they did the review afterwards. Same with stations, something like that. Like if you're going to use stations and sometimes I have adults and sometimes I don't, again, think about some of these ideas about, could you have a student-led station? Could a paraprofessional be involved as a facilitator? Maybe the paraprofessional has to follow the student to various stations, or maybe they have to stay at a station to make that work when another adult isn't available. But you have to kind of think about, can we still use a wide range of structures? You probably can use a wide range, maybe not as wide of a range, but you will still be able to use some of these with some of that plan B in place. So, and again, planning and patterns is going to be your friend. Having some repetition about what instruction looks like from are there what you do on Monday morning, what you do on Friday afternoon, when do you have certain repetitive activities, community builders, breaks, all those kinds of things that can be predictable can help with the collaborative planning elements. And that's always especially for those that are floating in and out of classrooms, that's really key. All right, before I end, I just want to give you two quick kind of food for thought. Those are sort of the big ideas, but I want to touch on some lesson ideas, some design ideas. And so there are some different sort of considerations for planning and thinking about lesson design. And so I think this is worth just a little bit of a thought of what this looks like for us. And essentially what we're thinking about is the lesson itself has to have a couple of elements. And the three elements, which we've talked a little bit about, but again, you may not see this as pure co-teaching, but these are things that both teachers have to be on the same page about. And the first thing is, for kids with more extensive support needs, we have to get away from really didactic instruction. So that means we have to kind of get it off the page. And so if we can think about not only using things like our co-teaching structures, but other ways to kind of share space and time in the classroom. And there's lots of things we might do as co-teaching partners that have nothing to do with the structures themselves. So whether that's, playing classroom games and using two teachers creatively, whether that's having, simulations in the classroom. Here's having students, I was always the teacher that wanted to sort of go big. And so co-teaching should allow us to do that in some new ways, right? So can you now, maybe before it was really hard to do that, but can you now think about things like, hey, is it possible to have us maybe we're going to do focus groups. We've never done focus groups before. We can do that because there are two teachers or more educators. So keeping it off the page, keeping it vibrant, not every moment, but when possible, that's going to be really key for access for kids with a wide range of needs. The other idea is being really clear about standards and targets. And so this is the other thing. This is true of all kids, but really for kids that have different objectives than the rest of the students, we have to be clear together as a team, not just two teachers, but everybody. What is the goal for this person? And so for some kids, if the standard is evaluating the power and responsibilities of citizens, political parties, interest groups, and the media, then what is the goal? What is the adapted standard for the student with a disability? And so that might be that, identifying one or two political parties. Maybe by the end of the unit or the lessons, the student will know that. Or maybe one of the goals is initiating a response to a teacher question. If we are not on the same page, and we both don't have an understanding that that is success for this student. And if one teacher thinks that success is the student meeting, the traditional or the whole class goal or objective, inclusive education, the collaborative relationship will be seen as unsuccessful. So really saying, sitting down together and being able to say, this is success, and these are the adapted goals for this person. And then finally, from an assessment standpoint or from a standpoint of appropriate challenge, one of the ideas you might take back is differentiating demands. And so you want to make sure we've kind of hit on that by thinking about personal support. We've kind of hit on that by thinking about the kinds of materials we bring in. But you want to think about, are we communicating really clearly about the demands for this student versus the demands for this student? Does our paraprofessional understand that? Does the occupational therapist that works in the classroom understand that? Does the general educator, multilingual teacher see that this student's success is attempting to write the paragraph, another student writing it without support, for another student it's writing with a paragraph frame? Is it being able to, find slope, but through the use of this visual support? Is listening to the story, is it appropriate, for this student's going to listen to the story versus read the story, and that is a success marker. So that's part of the conversation too. And so you're going to get a reading from the book, from UDL book, about differentiating demands and all the different ways you can do that, from differentiating the degree of difficulty to allowing for variation in the performance of skills, to providing scaffolds and so on. So that might be useful in the conversations that you're having. So I'm hoping, I know that's a lot of material in a short period of time. And that's why I really wanted you to take away one idea, just one big idea here, whether that's something about planning or whether that's something about relationships or that's something structural. So if I could at this point, I know we're at time, but if you have a minute, would you just put in the chat, if you could take one idea and try to implement it, fairly immediately? Is it, again, is it something small? Is it a resource? What is that one thing? Maybe it's just thinking about 100% for 100%. Or using your staff at all adults differently, or maybe it's, again, that last idea of looking at demands. What is sticking with you? Because I'm hoping that just by typing that in, maybe it's the lesson plan for paras, that can be sticky enough to kind of give you the motivation to go ahead and follow through on that. So thank you, shaking it up. Thank you, Janelle. As that's coming in, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to just remind you that you can find me at Inclusion Rules. Love these that are coming in. Yeah, the ways to use paras. I like that. Get it off the page. You know what I like is I like how the range of ideas is so different. Rigor, thinking about rigor in a different way. Excellent. Yeah, think about, don't throw out co-teaching with the bathwater, right? Who else is available in our space? I love how you put that too. That's great. Our Rose, yeah. Different co-teachers having a purpose. And once you have grabbed that one idea, don't forget you can go back to the Padlet and find many others. All right, Janelle, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Paula Kluth, for your expertise. Amazing examples. You really re-energized all of us. Thank you, thank you. And to our amazing participants, appreciate your time this afternoon, and keep on a lookout for an email with the recording and the resource Padlet. Everything will be posted there. We appreciate your time and your engagement in the chat.
Yes.
Amazing. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the nice comments. We're seeing them.